welcome to JS on Politics, a weekly look at what's happening in political news in Wisconsin. I'm your host, Greg Borowski. We're back after a week off for Thanksgiving, so let's just give you a quick look at what's on tap for today. Paul Ryan, the new Speaker of the House, lays out his agenda in a speech in Washington. We'll take a look at it and how his first weeks in office are going. The spring election season is officially underway. How are those races shaping up? And stop us if you've heard this before. The state Supreme Court rules against the John Doe prosecutors. Does this finally close the case? And finally, we're working some viewer questions, so please send those in. But let's start with introducing our panel here. We've some of our regulars: Dan Bice, Watchdog columnist; Mary Spicuzza, political reporter; and from Madison we have Jason Stein. And we're going to start just talking a little bit about Paul Ryan's speech. It's actually still going on, so don't tune away. You can find that later on, on YouTube or something. But let's talk about it. This is a kind of an unusual thing to be out setting the agenda. A few months ago, Ryan was on the sidelines, not in the presidential race. What is this unusual to be setting an agenda like this at this stage?
Sure. From the first part of it, the content wasn't so surprising. He said he was just trying to establish the fundamentals that all Republicans could agree on. But yeah, it seems like he's trying to change and remake the fundamental role of what a House Speaker is, instead of reacting to the president and so forth and waiting for a Republican nominee. He's decided to get out front and try to establish an agenda. But that's the Paul Ryan that all of us here know. He prefers policy to shuffling numbers and making sure everybody's in line.
Yeah, well, we know too. I mean, during election season is often the worst time to get things done, right? So do you think some of these things he's proposing will actually get done, or is it more about setting sort of the bar and say, this is what Republicans stand for, we're not Obama, and what the Democrats stand for?
I think there are some big issues that they're not going to get done. Obviously, he said they're not going to try to take on immigration, which is a huge issue before the next president takes office. But I think he is trying to set a tone for the party. I think he's trying to kind of step in, as a lot of Republican presidential candidates. It's kind of getting pretty ugly in some ways, and I think he is trying to define what the party is. There's been criticism that it's the party of Trump now, and I think he's probably trying to get in front of that.
There was one early allusion to that, in which he was talking about our military, and he said he doesn't want it to be one of bluster and so forth, and instead to just be quietly confident. But yet, the big question, I think, for Paul Ryan is going to be, does anyone care what his vision is for the party? He's trying to set this out. He's announced that this is a major policy announcement, but the one who's going to lead the party is the Republican nominee. And is this an attempt to influence the nomination process or not? We'll have to see.
Jason, let me ask you quickly for your thoughts on that. Typically the nominee is the person who's the face of the party. Right now they've got how many faces are still out there for the Republicans? More than a dozen. How is this a good opportunity for Ryan to sort of elevate his profile and put his stamp on things?
Well, there's certainly a vacuum right now in terms of the Republican presidential race, because you don't have that front runner who could unify all the wings of the party. But at the same time, one challenge I think that Paul Ryan may have in the coming months is what is his wheelhouse? His wheelhouse is the federal budget, overhauling entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and those are very important issues, very timely issues, things he knows a lot about. But with the terrorist attacks in Paris and this latest incident in California, the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, you see more and more attention of ordinary Americans being put towards national security, foreign policy, and those areas are not Paul Ryan's greatest strengths. So that will be, as he tries to sort of set some of the agenda, that will be one of the challenges that he faces.
All right, well, we're going to go to a tape segment right now with our Washington Bureau Chief, Craig Gilbert, to talk a little bit about how Paul Ryan's been doing in Washington so far in his new role. We're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington Bureau Chief, and we want to talk, Craig, a little bit about Paul Ryan and how he's approaching his job and this speech this morning. So first, can you just give us a sense, he's been in this role for a few weeks now, what's the general assessment in Washington of how he's approaching the job and how he's doing?
Well, he's getting pretty good reviews. I mean, he's in his second month now, and for a guy who hadn't planned on being Speaker and nobody thought would be Speaker until pretty recently, he's doing this with, some deliberation. He's showing some strategic thinking. He's been kind of very deliberate and calculating about how he communicates. A huge presence in the media. He's negotiated some of these early minefields with flying colors. He got a Syrian refugee bill passed with a quarter of the Democratic caucus. He's passing big legislation on education and transportation this week. He's got a real test coming up on a spending bill to avoid a government shutdown. But he is saying right now, he's expressing a lot of confidence that there will be no government shutdown. And if he can avoid that fate, he'll have succeeded at least in the launch of his speakership.
All right, well, what's the purpose of this speech today, where he's sort of setting out his agenda a little bit and trying to, chart a course going forward? What do you think he's hoping to accomplish here?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, this is happening in the middle of a Republican presidential campaign that is causing a lot of anxiety in his own party. People are very nervous, insiders, about the possibility of a Donald Trump nomination. So I think he's trying to put his stamp on the party's message. He is the most powerful Republican in Washington, and he's trying to lay out a message that I think in some ways may be a counter to Donald Trump. I don't think that's the explicit mission of this speech, but he's also trying to do something that he's talked about for years and years and years, which is kind of position his party as offering a very clear and, as he says, bold alternative to Democrats. He's talked ever since he got the speakership about trying to turn 2016 into a very defining election in which Republicans, if they win, can govern with something like a mandate.
Yeah, he's talked, I know, in recent weeks about not wanting to just be the opposition party. Here's the proposition of what we're going to do. And the things he's highlighting, I mean, can we glean anything from that? I assume we're going to hear about Medicaid and Medicare and...
Yeah, you're going to hear about some
of
the kinds of proposals that we're familiar with from his budgets and his roadmap, which is trimming and overhauling some domestic spending programs, including things that affect the social safety net. He's going to talk about traditional Republican ideas like building up the military, a strong defense. He's going to talk, obviously, in some very broad strokes about what he sees as the difference between the two parties' sort of governing philosophy. So, what he's trying to do is a little bit tricky, because on the one hand, he's trying to lay out kind of a bold conservative agenda that can keep, I think that his base can begin to rally around, but at the same time, he's governing in an environment where Republicans can't really get things done legislatively. So his message to Republicans and conservatives is there's a real limit to what we can do under a Democratic president. We need to elect a Republican president. In the meantime, this is what we stand for. Have some patience. We're going to keep the trains running and the lights on. Bear with us until we can get a Republican in the White House.
All right. Well, thank you for that insight, Craig, and have a good day.
Anytime.
All right, we're back live, and we're going to turn our attention now to the local elections. It's spring election season, and the candidates are out circulating papers. Some are running, some are not running. One who is running, Mary, we're going to talk with Tom Barrett about Tom Barrett. He's running for his fourth term. Mm-hmm. What's his sort of rationale after his years in office? Or what's he hanging his hat on? Why does he feel like voters should elect him again?
He's saying that he still wakes up every day determined to make a difference for the city of Milwaukee. He's touting all of the economic development and projects that have been going on downtown, not only the Bucks Arena, but just, he always calls it the renaissance of downtown development. He acknowledges that there's more work to do on, obviously, public safety with the spike in homicides, but he basically said he's not done yet. And, he's got kids in college, as some people have said, but he's not, he's 61, that's not exactly retirement age.
That's his sort of case. What's the case, Dan, against Tom Barrett to say we'll give you four more years?
The main criticism has been crime related, and so you should expect to see him directly involved with various crime scenes and stuff in the next couple of weeks. But the other two, his main two opponents, Alderman Davis and Alderman Donovan, haven't laid out much of a plan, an alternative vision for what they want. So I think right now he's sitting pretty comfortably in terms of running for re-election.
Yeah, what's the sense at City Hall, Mary, in terms of the other two? Because you've got two sitting aldermen running against the sitting mayor. Who's better positioned between Davis and Donovan to get through a primary and face Barrett, who we assume will be in the finals.
Donovan said that he's confident that there are going to be two names on the ballot, and it's going to be him and Mayor Barrett. He's been campaigning for quite a while, and obviously hitting the mayor on public safety issues. He keeps saying that it's just disappointing, it's not enough, but he hasn't, as Dan said, he hasn't really laid out what he would do differently on public safety. He's just basically
He's
saying
actually been-
Barrett's not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, he's been hitting this public safety drumbeat for years and years. There's nothing really new on that. The question is, what would he do if he were mayor beyond that?
But do either of the other two have the financial wherewithal to get their message out there on TV and radio and all the other avenues we'd expect in a race like this?
I think that they face a pretty tough uphill battle. I
think
guess
the
it
only
depends on
way-
outside groups. And
Yeah, that's the only way they win, is if an outside group comes in, spends hundreds of thousands of dollars beating up on Barrett, and that Donovan or Davis is then the beneficiary of those attacks. I think that's the only way that one of those two could win.
All right, speaking of money, let's shift to the county executive
Where
race.
there's a lot of money
Where there
being
is a lot
spent.
of money. Dan, talk about that one. Chris
battle-
Abel's put a lot of money
right.
in. Chris Larson's going to be overmatched financially. What
Right,
are
it's
we
the battle of the two Chris's. One, Chris Abele, who's already bought more than $500,000 worth of TV time. People might not be even sure why they're seeing him on TV so much, and mailers. I think I've gotten 8 of them at my house. So he's probably going to spend at least $1 million by the end of the year. And some are saying that by April he will spend about $5 million. On the other side, you have Chris Larson, state senator, who's not spending much money at all. He's done some press releases, has a couple of endorsements, and in the past week his campaign manager left pretty abruptly, Rick Coelho, and so he's brought on his former campaign manager who helped him win his Senate race in 2010, Josh Kilroy. But that's, right now it seems to be a one-sided battle.
Yeah, Jason, is just as Chris Larson is a sitting, senator. How in Madison, are you picking up any scuttlebutt out there about people how he's doing or not doing? Or I'm guessing people aren't planning a run for his soon-to-be open seat at this stage.
No,
I guess soon-to-be
Look,
open as if he had won, because
Look,
no one's
it's
expecting
early. It's certainly true that Chris Larson got to where he is by taking on another Democrat, Jeff Plahey, who was, more conservative or more to the center, and he ran to the left of him and beat him. But Chris Abele is a very different situation than that Jeff Plahey race. Again, I guess I would go back to you just don't see a campaign manager leave and have that interpreted as a good sign for the candidate. That's not how it works.
Yeah. Do you see, Dan, any outside money coming into this race? Is there a group that's so
Obviously,
opposed to Abele to help
the
finance
unions,
Larson?
the unions are very dissatisfied with Larson, and they'll provide some help. The question is
With
Abele.
With Abele, since Act 10, their numbers are reduced pretty significantly, though. So is this going to be door-to-door help, or is this going to be TV help, or what sort of help they'll provide? That's, I think, the big question.
All right, Jason, I want to ask you a little bit about the state Supreme Court, which is and how that race is shaping up. We've got Justice Rebecca Bradley, who's recently appointed, and Joanne Kloppenberg, Joe Donald. Do you get any early sense on how that race will shape up for folks who are interested in court watching these days?
Sure. So you have the conservative Justice Rebecca Bradley, who was recently appointed by Governor Scott Walker. You have Joe Donald, the Milwaukee County judge, and Joanne Kloppenberg, an appellate court judge. We will see how that plays out. Typically, given that they're low turnout, pretty low information races, you see Supreme Court incumbents do very well. Even being sort of a relatively new incumbent, Rebecca Bradley, like the other candidates, has also been a judge. So we'll see. The opponents are going to try and use Bradley's ties to Governor Walker against her. I guess the question will be, Governor Walker is obviously underwater in terms of his approval ratings in the state, but on the other side, it's going to be a low turnout election where, a Republican presidential race may still be live. You may have a lot of conservative voters coming out in April. So will ties to Scott Walker hurt Rebecca Bradley in the context of that low turnout election? We'll have to see.
Let me ask Maria what you think in terms of the money on the other side, because we've seen some very expensive Supreme Court races there, and it's not coming from the candidate themselves as much as these other groups. Is there the wherewithal or the appetite on the more liberal side to try to get Bradley out and one of these other candidates in?
There certainly was the last one when Kloppenburg took on Prosser. There was a lot of outside spending, a lot of outside interest. It was really seen as a referendum on Walker. I think Prosser said he felt like the victim of a drive-by shooting at one point, that it wasn't about him anymore, that it was really about the governor. I think there is going to be some of that. I guess the question is, do they feel like Kloppenburg, or do they feel like there's a viable candidate who can beat her with that spending, and do they have enough given everything else that's going on?
Kloppenburg didn't run a particularly good campaign against Prosser. She underperformed compared to other people who were on the ballot at that time. The question is, can they come and get the sort of numbers they would need in Milwaukee and Madison to defeat Rebecca Bradley?
Do you guys have a sense of Donald and Kloppenburg, who's more likely to, assuming that Bradley will make it through based on the divisions of their
Obviously,
personality,
Kloppenburg's known better since she's run before, but as Jason said, it's very hard to beat incumbents, and I think there's only one incumbent who's run for Supreme Court who's ever lost, and that's Justice Butler, who lost, and there were a number of things going on there. So Joe Donald's been out there. He is campaigning hard. He was I think he was the first one to announce. So, but I think if you were betting on it, I would guess Kloppenburg at this point.
All right, well, let's keep talking about the Supreme Court, but shift our focus. This is, of course, the latest ruling in the John Doe case this week. And Jason, I want to have you just give us a quick sense of what happened. So they ruled that the prosecutor is improperly appointed. They're going to retain and not destroy evidence. Where does that sort of leave this issue that has been lingering for some time?
Right, Greg. Well, you had an investigation that had been stopped for some time. You had the special prosecutor in the case, Fran Schmitz, asking for a reconsideration of that ruling. The Supreme Court, denied that, left the investigation stopped. At this point, it's a question of whether someone will appeal that decision all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's put into a lot of question whether Fran Schmitz can be that person to make that appeal because, again, the Supreme Court ruled he was improperly appointed. But they did also leave the door open for other prosecutors involved in that case, like Milwaukee County DA John Chisholm, to intervene, take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. But obviously, they're the nation's highest court. They get a lot of requests, a lot of appeals, and the vast majority of them are not taken up. So, that's at best a long shot for the prosecutor.
Yeah, I mean, the court usually they'll choose things that have a particular interest or something that's unsettled in law. Is this? Do you see something here that would be so appealing to the Supreme Court to say we must get in and settle that, or is this a state issue that they would stay out?
I mean, there are reasons to think that they might take it up. I mean, it involves, very important players in our, in society. You've got governors, you've got wealthy interests involved in elections. You've got, in the overall cases, you've got issues of free speech. In the issue, that sort of would form the basis of the appeal, you have this question of can a state Supreme Court judge who had a group like the Wisconsin Club for Growth that's involved in a lawsuit that was spending on a judge's election race, then years down the line sit in judgment of a case that involves that group, that independent group. So, and these are the kinds of issues that you have seen the U.S. Supreme Court take up in the past. But again, it's always, I think, kind of a tough slog to get them to take your case.
But you had it on the other side earlier when the defendants in this went to federal court and tried to get the federal court to jump in and say this is a free speech issue, and instead the appeals court in Chicago said this is a state issue and the state Supreme Court should be the one dealing with these things. I mean, you could probably expect that that the U.S. Supreme Court would also say, well, this seems to be more of a state matter. Yes, there are issues of free speech and important players in this, but whether we like a ruling or not, this is something that the state Supreme Court should be.
The case, I always, when I think back at the high school civics class, and they said, well, you go from the circuit court to the appellate court to this, and it's sort of this natural, normal path. This was like a Rube Goldberg-esque sort of up and down. But do you think it seems destined to go there? Would you say,
Well, I
Mary,
don't think
that
anybody was surprised by the ruling that the Wisconsin Supreme Court didn't change its mind and decide that they should go ahead with the case. So I think this just seemed like a mandatory step to get to be considered by the U.S.
This is
Supreme
like
Court.
the zombie.
In fact, it was a mandatory step. It
Right.
was
Yeah.
a step that needed to be taken.
Before
And one thing that's worth noting is I think the basis of the appeal would be on this narrow issue of whether or not the state Supreme Court justices needed to recuse themselves. There's a lot of other stuff kind of in the ether or in the mix, like free speech, like whether or not this was political persecution, the investigation. But I think an appeal would hinge on a more narrow set of issues.
All right, well, we're going to turn to some viewer questions now. And Jason, I'm going to throw this first one to you. The viewer is No
Thanks.
Name, who says, the Republican governors are dropping like flies. Who is the next candidate to drop out? And I assume this is talking about the presidential campaign. What do you
Right.
think?
Well, I mean, clearly, I could take the easy route and say, like, people like George Pataki or Jim Gilmore, those guys, like, why are they even in the race in the first place? I've never understood it. But I mean, if you're talking about more of the, more serious candidates, I mean, I think if you're Lindsey Graham, for instance, or if you're Chris Christie and you're saying, especially let's say Lindsey Graham, he seemed to have been in the race to put foreign policy more in the center of the American political debate. Well, it's in the center of the debate now. So why are you there if you're him to get a chance to become a vice presidential nominee? Why are you still in the race? I don't understand from my perspective.
Well, let me ask these guys here. I mean, because if you're running a shoestring campaign, you just have to support that shoestring. If you're running a much bigger campaign, as Governor Walker was, you have to support more. Who do you guys think is the next person to have to drop out?
The question asked about Republican governors, and I think there's one Republican governor who's doing much better today than he was during the debate, and that's Chris Christie. He's picked up support in New Hampshire, and he seems to be doing pretty well in terms of meeting. I mean, it seems to be his format to meet and talk to people in small groups. But you're right. When you are on the smaller budget, it's not really hurting you to travel around and to give the minor speeches and so forth. You're not getting much attention to begin with. I don't know.
But one question is too that you can keep going. It's not going to hurt you to keep going. But
Right.
at what point do some of these elected leaders say, maybe this is hurting my party for me to stay in this race and for not allow voters to have a more clear-cut, thin-down field that the media could maybe do a better job of presenting.
I mean, the thing of it, let me ask Mary for her taking this. If you took the bottom 5 or 6 or 7 candidates, you're going to get, what, 5% of the vote, maybe? It's really the other ones that's the trouble. You've got Trump and Carson, and then this, the other ones are polling in the more moderate range, and they may not see a reason to drop out yet. They want to play it out.
Yeah, if they're not running a Governor Walker campaign where they're burning through tons of money and their popularity is sinking at home, I don't think there's a rush to get out. And I think some of the governors, like Jeb Bush, who hasn't been doing very well, is hoping that some of the appeal of outsiders will drop when they start having these really high-profile flubs.
I think there's still some
There's
still some ebb and flow going on. You see in Iowa that Ben Carson's lost support and it's shifted to Cruz in recent weeks. So I think there's still a lot of movement to be had.
All right, now next question, I'm going to throw this one to Dan first. This is from Just Asking, who says, who is going to go down as the biggest loser of 2015? Has to be Scott Walker, right? And we're getting ahead of our show, but who do you think at this stage is the biggest loser of 2015?
Well, it was a really rough year for Scott Walker. I mean, to have built it up, put his entire focus on running for president, he didn't seem to have lost control of the agenda in Madison, and then he's the first one out of the race and one of the shortest political campaigns ever for president. it's hard to make the case that anyone else had a worse year in Wisconsin politically.
Especially when you think of how his year started out. Was it late January that he was at the Iowa Freedom Caucus and had this knock it out of the park speech and soared to the top of the polls and was just like riding high where it looked like there was no way he wouldn't make it to the caucuses, and then now
but did he do anything? Jason, let me ask you, because we've seen on the Republican side in particular sort of the next in line sort of approach on president. Does Walker, did he do anything himself in terms of policy-wise, things to hurt himself in this campaign, or is it just he maybe seems lackluster and would be in a tougher position to run in say 4 or 8 years?
There were certainly some times where he appeared to take one position, then refine it, and then refine it again. And I think
and then reverse it.
Right. And I think for his particular brand, his brand was a straight-talking leader who was not a politician, who was not going to have his finger in the wind, who was going to do what he thought was right. I think that was particularly challenging for him, and will be going forward. I don't think he had the kind of stupendous flubs that, say, a Rick Perry had in 2012 that seemed to make it just impossible for him to run this time around. But the other thing, it really appears that it's so often in politics, your moment comes and is gone. I mean, you think about Chris Christie, who had a moment in past cycles to run for president, had people from his party almost begging him to run, and then this cycle has struggled to get traction. I know he's gotten a little bit lately, but really has struggled through most of this cycle. So hard to predict.
Look at where Walker was this time last year. He had just won re-election. We weren't sure what the ceiling was. Nationally, a lot of people didn't know him, but those who did liked him. Now we have a pretty good idea where the ceiling is, and his future is Wisconsin, and in Wisconsin his numbers are not good. I mean, it's a very different landscape for him.
All right, well, let's get our last question in, and I'll throw this one to Mary first. It's from Milwaukee Maven, who says, is this going to be Tom Barrett's last term as mayor? And if so, who's next in line? So who's out there, and do you think,
Are we talking like this term or if he wins?
I think they mean
if he wins.
They're already bored with this election, so they're looking 5 years down the road.
To 2020, I guess.
I would be surprised if Mayor Barrett loses this time around, but I guess there's still a ways to go before the election. But if I don't know that he would get a 5th term. I think, 4 years from now, if public safety is still not doing well, if unemployment numbers are high, he might have a rougher time running, but I don't see him getting.
I think we'd have a replay of 2004 where when Norquist decided not to run, or when he left office, you had how many, 9 candidates?
It was more than that. If you give me enough beer, I could probably name
I remember
them all.
the Brady Bunch ad that had the 9 lined up.
Yeah.
So, but there were a lot of people who thought they would do a good job as mayor, and I assumed that the same thing would happen. The question would be, would some of those people be too far down the road? Would Gwen Moore want to be mayor? Would any of the senators want to be mayor? I think it would be a wide open field.
I just speculated on what would happen with Scott Walker in 4 years, but having just committed that sin, I will say, I think trying to predict an election 4 years out, it's sort of like predicting the weather 3 weeks.
I think
from
we should
Thanks,
see.
Stein.
You can do it.
You bailed me out.
I don't know if there's a lot of value to it.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week at Contemporary Political Times next Thursday at the same time, same location. So we hope you tune in next week.